Sometimes a man's greatest failure becomes his greatest strength. When 58-year-old Calvin Davis watched flames swallow his entire world, his job, his home, every penny he'd saved, he looked down at his 9-year-old son Jamal and made a promise that would change everything. They walked into the Tennessee woods with nothing but the clothes on their backs and found an old, rusted school bus buried in vines. Most people would have seen junk. Calvin saw hope. Day by day, father and son turned that broken shell into a real home. Calvin taught Jamal how to make fire, how to find food, how to survive when the world gives up on you. They built something beautiful from nothing. Winter came hard, but they were ready. Then a hiker took one photo of their hidden home, and everything changed. What happened when their story reached the world? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The factory ID badge in Calvin's wallet had become nothing more than a piece of plastic, but he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. 20 years of punching that time clock, 20 years of steady paychecks, 20 years of building something for his son, all reduced to ash and memory in a single night. He sat on the edge of the motel bed, watching Jamal organize his school backpack for the third time that morning, arranging and rearranging his few remaining possessions like they were precious artifacts. "Dad, Mrs. Peterson said I could come back to school once we get settled somewhere," Jamal said, his voice carrying that careful optimism children use when they're trying to make their parents feel better. The backpack held everything that remained of his childhood, a worn copy of Where the Red Fern Grows, 3 notebooks with his careful handwriting, a picture of his mother taken 2 summers before the cancer, and a small wooden car Calvin had carved for his 7th birthday. Calvin reached over and smoothed down his son's hair, noting how much Jamal had grown in the past year. The boy was all legs and elbows now, outgrowing his clothes faster than Calvin could afford to replace them. Even before the fire, money had been tight. Since Maria's death 3 years ago, it had been just the 2 of them against the world, and Calvin had done his best to be both mother and father. Some days he felt like he was succeeding. Other days, like today, he wondered if his best would ever be enough. "We'll find our place," Calvin said, meaning it. He'd been saying the same thing for 2 weeks now, ever since they'd checked into this roadside motel with its thin walls and thinner hope. The manager, a kind woman named Mrs. Chen, had given them a weekly rate and didn't ask too many questions about why a grown man and his boy were living out of duffel bags. But Calvin could see the questions in her eyes, the same ones that lived in the mirror every morning. The insurance settlement had been smaller than expected, something about policy exclusions and depreciated value that the adjuster had explained, with the detached professionalism of a man who went home to his own house every night. Calvin had nodded and signed papers, but the numbers didn't add up to a new start. They added up to maybe 3 months in this motel if they were careful, less if Jamal got sick or if the truck needed repairs. Calvin had spent those 2 weeks driving from town to town, filling out applications at every factory, warehouse, and construction site within 50 miles. His back was still strong at 58, his hands steady, his work ethic unquestionable, but the jobs weren't there. And the ones that went to younger men with fewer questions and no children to worry about. The economic downturn had hit Tennessee hard, and Calvin was just another casualty in a war he didn't understand. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Through the peephole, he saw Carol Smith, the social worker who'd been assigned to their case. She was younger than Calvin, maybe 40, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of determined compassion that came from believing the system could still work if you pushed hard enough. "Mr. Davis, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Calvin opened the door, automatically straightening his posture. He'd learned long ago that how you presented yourself mattered, especially when dealing with people who held your future in their hands. "Ms. Smith, come in. Jamal, this is the lady I told you about." Carol stepped inside, her trained eyes quickly cataloguing their temporary home. Calvin watched her take note of the neat beds, the small pile of clean clothes, Jamal's homework spread across the tiny table. He knew she was building a picture in her mind, deciding whether this was a family in temporary crisis or something more concerning. "How are you holding up, Jamal?" she asked, settling into the single chair while Calvin and his son sat on the bed. "We're doing okay," Jamal replied, and Calvin felt a surge of pride at his son's composure. "Dad's been helping me with my math, and I've been reading about Daniel Boone." Carol smiled. "Daniel Boone. That's interesting. What got you interested in him?" "Dad told me stories about how his own daddy used to take him camping in the mountains when he was little. Daniel Boone lived in the wilderness and knew how to survive anywhere." Calvin felt his throat tighten. Those camping trips with his father had been the best memories of his childhood. Long weekends in the Smoky Mountains, where his dad had taught him to fish, to read the weather, to find water and shelter. His father had been a quiet man who worked construction during the week, but came alive in the woods, sharing knowledge that seemed to flow from some deep well of practical wisdom. "Your father was quite the outdoorsman," Carol observed. "Still is," Jamal said loyally. Carol pulled out a folder and opened it carefully. "I've been working on your housing application, and I'm afraid the waiting list for subsidized housing is longer than we hoped. The earliest opening might be 6 months, maybe more." Calvin felt the walls of the small room pressing closer. 6 months in this motel would eat through their remaining money long before a spot opened up. He'd done the math a dozen times, hoping for a different answer. What about temporary assistance? Something to bridge the gap? There are programs, but they're stretched thin right now. I can get you on several lists, but I can't promise anything soon. Carol's expression was genuinely sympathetic. "Have you considered reaching out to family?" "Sometimes there's no family," Calvin said quietly. His parents were gone. Maria's parents had never approved of their marriage, and his few cousins had scattered across the country years ago. "It's just us." Carol nodded, making notes. "Mr. Davis, I want you to know that Jamal's welfare is my primary concern. I can see that he's well cared for and that you're doing everything you can. But if your situation doesn't improve soon, we may need to discuss alternative arrangements." The words hung in the air like a blade. Calvin understood the subtext. If he couldn't provide stable housing soon, they might take Jamal away. The thought made his chest tight and his hands clench involuntarily. "I'll find something," he said, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest. After Carol left, Calvin sat on the bed and stared at the water stain on the ceiling. Jamal had gone back to his homework, but Calvin could feel his son's worried glances. The boy was too smart and had heard too much. He knew their situation was precarious. That night, after Jamal had fallen asleep, Calvin stepped outside into the humid Tennessee air and called his father's voice from memory. Samuel Davis had been gone for 5 years now, but his lessons lived on in the quiet corners of Calvin's mind. He remembered the compass his father had carried, the one Calvin now kept in his own pocket, a battered brass instrument that had guided them through countless adventures in the mountains. His father had taught him that sometimes the best path wasn't the obvious one. Sometimes you had to strike out into unknown territory and trust your instincts to find your way. Samuel Davis had grown up during the Depression, when making do with less wasn't a lifestyle choice, but a survival skill. He'd known how to hunt and fish, how to build shelter from whatever materials were at hand, how to read the land like other men read newspapers. Calvin pulled the compass from his pocket and held it in the pale light from the motel's neon sign. The needle pointed steadily north, toward the mountains where he'd learned to be more than just another factory worker's son. Maybe it was time to remember those lessons. The next morning, Calvin made a decision that would change everything. He told Jamal they were going on an adventure, just like the ones Grandpa Samuel used to take Calvin on. He packed their few belongings into the truck, paid Mrs. Chen for one final week, and drove north toward the mountains that had shaped his boyhood. "Where are we going, Dad?" Jamal asked, as they left the last of the suburbs behind. "Somewhere your grandfather showed me a long time ago," Calvin replied, his hands steady on the wheel. "Somewhere we can figure things out without anyone telling us what we should do." Jamal nodded, his trust absolute in the way that only children can manage. As they climbed into the foothills, Calvin felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. Maybe they couldn't make it in the world that had rejected them. But there was another world waiting in those mountains, one where a man's worth wasn't measured by his paycheck, but by his ability to provide for his family through skill and determination. The compass in his pocket seemed to grow warm against his leg, pointing not just north, but toward a future Calvin couldn't yet imagine. Behind them, the smoke from distant factories faded into memory. Ahead, the mountains waited with their ancient promise of refuge for those brave enough to accept their terms. Calvin's father's compass trembled in his palm as he stood at the edge of the overgrown trail. 40 years had passed since he'd last walked this path, but his feet seemed to remember the way. The forest had reclaimed much of what used to be clear markers. Fallen logs now served as nurses for saplings, and undergrowth had swallowed the old blazes his father had carved into oak trees. But the mountains themselves were unchanged, rising around them like ancient guardians, keeping watch over secrets only they remembered. "It's so quiet," Jamal whispered, his small hand finding Calvin's larger one. Calvin squeezed gently. The boy was right. The silence here was different from the dead quiet of their motel room. This was a living silence, full of rustling leaves and distant bird calls, the soft percussion of a creek somewhere ahead. It was the kind of quiet that made you listen deeper instead of feeling empty. They'd been walking for 2 hours, following game trails and half-remembered landmarks. Calvin's truck sat 3 miles behind them, hidden in a grove of pine trees where the old logging road finally gave up, trying to penetrate the wilderness. He'd packed everything they owned into 2 backpacks and a duffel bag. Not much to show for 58 years of living, but enough to start over if a man knew how to use what he had. "Dad, are we lost?" Jamal asked, though his voice carried more curiosity than fear. "No, son, just taking the long way around." Calvin checked the compass again, then looked up at the canopy where patches of late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves. Your grandfather always said the best campsites were the ones nobody else knew about." They crested a small ridge, and Calvin stopped so suddenly that Jamal bumped into his back. There, in a clearing that looked almost exactly as it had 4 decades ago, sat the skeleton of an old school bus. Vines had claimed it like some determined sculptor, wrapping around the yellow metal and threading through broken windows. The roof was rust-red with age, and small trees had sprouted from gaps where the floor had given way, but the basic structure remained solid. Calvin felt his breath catch in his throat. This was the place, the hidden sanctuary where his father had brought him during that magical summer when Calvin was 13. Samuel Davis had called it their thinking spot, a place to come when the world got too complicated, and a man needed to remember what really mattered. "What is that thing?" Jamal asked, his fear evaporating into wonder. "That," Calvin said, "is going to be our home." Jamal stared at the vine-covered bus, then up at his father. "Really? We're going to live in there?" Calvin knelt beside his son, meeting his eyes directly. This was the moment that would define everything that came after, the moment when he chose to step off the beaten path and trust in lessons learned long ago. "Jamal, I'm going to be honest with you because you're old enough to understand. We can't afford to keep living in that motel, and the people who want to help us might decide we'd be better off separated. I can't let that happen. I won't let that happen." Jamal's face grew serious, but he didn't look away. "So we're going to try something different. We're going to live the way your great-grandfather taught me, close to the land, taking care of ourselves, being free. It won't be easy, and it won't be like anything other kids your age are doing. But I promise you this, as long as we're together, we'll figure it out. Jamal looked back at the bus, then at the clearing around them. Calvin could see him processing the enormity of what they were contemplating. At 9 years old, he was being asked to leave behind everything familiar and trust his father's vision of a life he couldn't yet imagine. Will I still be able to learn things, like in school? You'll learn more here than you ever could in any classroom, Calvin promised. Your great-grandfather taught me things out here that helped me my whole life. I'll teach you everything he taught me, and we'll figure out the rest together. Jamal nodded slowly. Okay, Dad. Let's try it. Calvin felt a wave of emotion so strong, it nearly buckled his knees. His son's trust was absolute, generous, and terrifying. In that moment, Calvin understood that he was crossing a line from which there might be no return. If he failed here, if he couldn't provide for Jamal in this wild place, the consequences would be more severe than unemployment or eviction. But if he succeeded, if they succeeded together, they might build something that no factory fire or economic downturn could ever take away. They spent the remaining daylight hours exploring their new domain. The bus was in better condition than Calvin had expected. The engine was long dead, and the interior gutted, but the frame was solid, and the roof, though rusty, was intact. Windows were broken, but could be boarded up. The clearing provided good drainage and access to the creek they'd been hearing all afternoon. Calvin found himself moving with purpose for the first time in weeks. He walked the perimeter of the clearing, noting where the morning sun hit and where the prevailing wind would come from. He checked the distance to water and identified the flattest spots for building whatever they might need. His father's lessons were awakening dormant knowledge, stirring to life like seeds after a long winter. As the sun began to set, Calvin built their first fire in a ring of stones near the bus. The skill came back as if he'd never stopped. The careful selection of tinder, the patient nursing of sparks into flame, the gradual feeding of larger wood. Jamal watched with fascination as his father transformed from unemployed factory worker into something primal and capable. They ate a simple dinner of canned beans and crackers, but it tasted different here. More significant somehow. The fire cast dancing shadows on the bus's metal sides, making it look less like a derelict vehicle and more like a ship waiting to be restored to seaworthiness. Dad, were you scared when great-grandfather first brought you here? Calvin considered the question. I was excited more than scared, but I was older than you, and I knew we were going home at the end of the weekend. This is different. Different how? This time, we're not visiting the wilderness, we're joining it. They spread their sleeping bags on a flat patch of ground near the fire. Calvin lay awake long after Jamal's breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep, staring up through the canopy at stars that seemed closer than they ever had in town. The night sounds were a symphony he'd forgotten. Owls calling to each other across the darkness, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the constant whisper of wind through leaves. For the first time since the fire, Calvin felt something. Approaching peace. They had no electricity, no running water, no assurance that this desperate gamble would work. But they had each other. They had shelter, and they had access to everything the forest could provide. His father had survived the depression by knowing how to live off the land. Maybe it was time for that knowledge to serve another generation. Calvin's hand found the compass in his pocket, and he held it up toward the stars. The needle pointed steadily north, but Calvin realized it was pointing toward something more than a direction. It was pointing toward a different way of being in the world, one that measured wealth in skills and security in adaptability. Tomorrow would bring the real work, clearing the bus, setting up systems for water and sanitation, beginning the transformation from temporary shelter to permanent home. But tonight, lying under stars his father had shown him 40 years ago, Calvin allowed himself to believe they might actually pull this off. The bus sat waiting in the darkness, patient as the mountains themselves, ready to become whatever they needed it to be. Calvin's hands were already raw from a week of constant work, but the hand-carved fishing hook in his palm represented more than torn skin and aching muscles. It was proof that a man could create what he needed from what the world provided. And in the morning light filtering through the trees, it looked like hope carved from necessity. "Will it really work?" Jamal asked, examining the hook with the serious attention he'd once reserved for video games and comic books. "Your great-grandfather caught fish with hooks just like this one," Calvin replied, testing the point with his thumb. The bone had come from their dinner 2 nights ago, a rabbit Calvin had snared using techniques he hadn't thought about in decades. Nothing went to waste here. Nothing could go to waste. The first week had been a crash course in remembering what his father had taught him about living off the land. Calvin's city-softened hands had relearned the feel of working wood, his back had readjusted to sleeping on the ground, and his mind had slowly shifted from the artificial rhythms of factory life to the older patterns of sunrise and sunset, weather and season. Water had been their first priority. The creek was clean and cold, running fast enough to stay pure, but carrying buckets back and forth would consume too much of their energy. Calvin had spent 2 days building a system of bamboo, tubes and carved wooden channels to bring water directly to their camp. Jamal had helped, his small fingers perfect for fitting joints together while Calvin held the larger pieces in place. "Look, Dad, no leaks!" Jamal had shouted when they first tested the system, his voice carrying a pride that made Calvin's chest tight with emotion. The boy was adapting faster than Calvin had dared to hope, trading video game achievements for the satisfaction of solving real problems with his own hands. Food required more strategy. Calvin knew which plants were safe to eat, which mushrooms to avoid, where to look for edible roots and berries. He taught Jamal to identify wild onions and dandelion greens, to spot the heart-shaped leaves of violets, whose flowers could be eaten raw or cooked into a nutritious soup. They gathered black walnuts and acorns, learning to process the acorns to remove their bitter tannins. But plant food alone wouldn't sustain them through winter. Calvin's snares brought in the occasional rabbit or squirrel, and now the fishing. Hook promised to expand their protein sources. The creek was full of trout, their dark shapes visible in the deeper pools during the quiet hours of dawn and dusk. "Teaching time," Calvin announced, settling beside his son on the creek bank. "First, lesson. Fish think with their stomachs, just like people. You show them something they want, they forget to be careful." He demonstrated how to dig for earthworms in the rich soil near the water's edge, how to bait the hook without making the worm look unnatural, how to read the water for signs of where fish might be hiding. Jamal absorbed every word, asking questions. That showed he was truly listening rather than just waiting for his turn to try. Their first fish was small, a speckled trout barely longer than Calvin's hand, but Jamal whooped with joy as if they'd landed a marlin. Calvin showed him how to clean it properly, wasting nothing, using every part they couldn't eat as bait or fertilizer for the wild plants they were cultivating near their camp. The bus itself was becoming more livable each day. Calvin had cleared out decades of accumulated leaves and debris, sealed the broken windows with salvaged plywood and plastic sheeting, and begun the slow process of transforming the interior from abandoned shell to functional shelter. The old bench seats made surprisingly comfortable beds when padded with pine boughs and covered with their sleeping bags. But it was the smaller improvements that gave Calvin the most satisfaction. Wooden pegs carved to hang their clothes, a shelf system built from fallen branches, a cooking area constructed from flat stones and scrap metal. Each addition made their temporary shelter feel more like a home. Jamal's education continued in ways no classroom could provide. He learned to identify trees by their bark and leaves, to predict weather changes by watching cloud formations and animal behavior. Calvin taught him to move quietly through the forest, to observe without disturbing, to see patterns that revealed where animals traveled and fed. Everything is connected. Calvin explained one afternoon as they watched a hawk circling overhead. That hawk keeps the rabbit population healthy by taking the sick and slow ones. The rabbits keep the plant growth balanced by eating the weak shoots. Even when things die, they feed the soil that grows the plants that feed the rabbits. Nothing is ever really wasted, like our fish bones feeding the garden. Exactly like that, but not every day was peaceful learning and gradual progress. Calvin had spotted signs that they weren't the only humans in these woods. Boot prints. Near the creek, the remains of a campfire that looked too recent for his comfort. He'd become hyper-vigilant about hiding evidence of their presence, camouflaging their improvements, and teaching Jamal to recognize the sound of approaching strangers. His greatest fear walked on two legs and wore a uniform. Park rangers patrolled this area periodically, and while Calvin wasn't entirely certain they were on public land, he knew that explaining their situation to authorities would likely mean separation from his son. Every distant engine sound made his pulse quicken. Every unexplained noise in the underbrush triggered his protective instincts. "Dad, what happens if someone finds us?" Jamal asked one evening as they sat by their carefully concealed fire. Calvin had been dreading this question, but he'd promised his son honesty. "We'll deal with that when it happens. Right now we're not hurting anyone, and we're taking good care of ourselves. Sometimes the right thing isn't the same as the legal thing. But you haven't done anything wrong." "No, son, I haven't. But some people might not see it that way. They might think a little boy should be in a regular house, going to regular school." Jamal stirred the coals with a stick, thinking, "But I'm learning more here than I ever did in school. Yesterday I learned how to make rope from tree bark, and how to tell if water is safe to drink, and why the moon looks different every night. Mrs. Peterson never taught us any of that stuff." Calvin felt his throat tighten. His son's confidence was growing daily, his curiosity expanding to fill all the space their new life provided. Jamal was becoming something Calvin hadn't expected, not just a survivor, but a scholar of the natural world, a young man at home in the wilderness that had once seemed so foreign. As they prepared for sleep, Calvin checked their water system one final time, tested the security of their food storage, and made sure their fire was properly banked for the night. These rituals had become as natural as breathing, a nightly inventory of their safety and preparedness. The hand-carved fishing hook caught the last light from the dying coals, a small testament to what they were building here. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, new small victories, to add to their growing sense that this impossible gamble might actually work. Jamal's journal had become their most precious possession, more valuable than the compass, more essential than their fishing gear. In the evening light, Calvin watched his son carefully recording the day's discoveries in his small notebook, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration as he struggled to capture everything they'd learned about reading animal tracks in the mud beside the creek. The raccoon prints had 5 toes, like little hands, Jamal wrote slowly, pausing to ask Calvin about the spelling of nocturnal. "Dad says they wash their food in the water because their hands are so sensitive. They can feel things better when they're wet. Like how your fingers work better for small stuff when you lick them first." The journal had been Jamal's idea. "If I'm not going to regular school, I need to keep track of what I'm learning so I don't forget," he'd announced with 9-year-old logic. Each entry was a window into how his mind was adapting to their new world. Part scientific observation, part personal reflection, part adventure story. Calvin had worried initially about Jamal's education, but watching his son document their daily discoveries made him realize that learning was happening at a pace and depth that no classroom could match. The boy was becoming fluent in a language that most adults had forgotten, the vocabulary of survival, the grammar of self-reliance, the literature of living in harmony with the natural world. "Dad, how come the rabbit tracks go in a straight line, but the fox tracks zigzag all over the place?" Jamal asked, looking up from his writing. "Different hunting strategies," Calvin explained, settling beside his son on their makeshift bench. "Built from a fallen log. Rabbits know exactly where they're going, to food or back to safety. They don't waste energy exploring. Foxes hunt by investigating anything that might be interesting. They follow scents, check out unusual sounds, patrol their territory. So the rabbit is efficient, but the fox is curious. That's a good way to put it. Both strategies work, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. The second week had brought major improvements to their living situation. Calvin had spent 2 days carefully removing sections of the bus's roof, creating openings he could cover with salvaged plywood and heavy plastic sheeting. The result was a shelter that could be open to the sky during pleasant weather and sealed against rain and cold when necessary. Jamal had helped throughout the process, learning to use tools safely and understanding how each modification served multiple purposes. Insulation had been their next project. Calvin showed Jamal how to gather specific types of moss that would maintain their insulating properties when dried, how to identify the best pine boughs for bedding, and how to create dead air spaces that would hold their body heat during cold nights. They'd stuffed the walls with layer upon layer of natural materials, transforming the metal shell into something that actually felt warm and welcoming. "It's like we're making the bus grow a fur coat," Jamal had observed, and Calvin had laughed at the accuracy of the comparison. Their daily routine had settled into patterns that felt both productive and peaceful. Early morning was for checking snares and fishing, taking advantage of the times when animals were most active. Mid-morning brought water gathering, fire maintenance, and food preparation. Afternoons were for larger projects, improving their shelter, expanding their food storage systems, or exploring new areas of their territory. Evenings were for education, reflection, and planning the next day's activities. Calvin had carved a chess set from pieces of wood, teaching Jamal the game by firelight while sharing stories of his own father's lessons. "Strategy is just thinking ahead," he explained as Jamal puzzled over how to protect his king from Calvin's advancing queen. "You look at what you have, figure out what your opponent might do, and make the move that gives you the most good choices later. Like when you decided to bring us here instead of staying in that motel." Calvin paused, with his knight hovering over the board. His son's observation cut straight to the heart of their situation with uncomfortable accuracy. "That's exactly right. I looked at our choices in town and didn't like where any of them led, so I made a move that gave us different options, even though it was scary. Especially because it was scary. Sometimes the safe move is actually the most dangerous one in the long run." Jamal nodded thoughtfully and moved his bishop to block Calvin's attack. The boy was learning to think several moves ahead, a skill that would serve him well beyond the chessboard. But their isolation wasn't complete. Calvin had spotted fresh tire tracks on the old logging road, and twice they'd heard engines in the distance. One afternoon, as they worked on expanding their vegetable garden with wild plants they'd transplanted from other areas, Calvin caught sight of movement through the trees, a figure in what looked like a uniform, too far away to identify, but close enough to make Calvin's pulse quicken. "Jamal, we need to practice our disappearing game," Calvin said quietly. They'd drilled this scenario several times. Within minutes, evidence of their presence vanished. The fire was scattered and covered with dirt, their tools hidden in predetermined locations, their personal belongings secured inside the bus, behind carefully arranged camouflage. Jamal knew to stay silent and still, following Calvin's lead as they waited in their hiding spot, deep in the underbrush. The figure moved through their clearing, a woman in the brown uniform of the park service, walking slowly, observing carefully. Calvin's heart hammered as she examined their fire ring, now looking like nothing more than stones someone might have arranged for a single night's camping months ago. She checked the area around the bus, but the vines and debris Calvin had strategically replaced made it look like it had been abandoned for years. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes, the ranger continued on her patrol route. Calvin and Jamal remained hidden for another hour before emerging from their hiding place. Was that one of the people who might try to separate us? Jamal whispered. Maybe. She might just have been doing her regular job, checking on the area. But we can't take chances. I wasn't scared, Jamal announced, and Calvin realized with a mixture of pride and concern that his son was telling the truth. The boy was adapting to danger, with the same natural resilience he'd shown for everything else about their new life. That evening, as Jamal wrote in his journal about their close call with discovery, Calvin found himself reflecting on how much they'd both changed in just 2 weeks. Jamal was growing stronger physically, more confident mentally, and more capable of handling whatever challenges their life presented. But he was also growing more isolated from the world of other children, more dependent on Calvin's judgment about what was safe and what was dangerous. Calvin opened his own small notebook, a habit he'd started after watching his son, and wrote, Day 14, Jay adapting better than hoped. Physical health excellent, learning accelerating, emotional state stable. My own confidence growing but isolation becoming more complete. No regrets about the choice, but aware that we're crossing lines we can't uncross. Need to remember this feeling, that we're building something worth protecting. The solar panel Calvin had salvaged from the dump gleamed like a black mirror in the morning sun, its surface cleaned and polished until it looked almost new. Joseph Martinez, the elderly man who ran the salvage yard 15 miles down the U mountain, had called it junk. Calvin called it opportunity. You sure this thing still works? Joseph had asked, helping Calvin load it into his truck bed alongside a collection of other discards. Car batteries, copper wire, and electronic components that most people would consider worthless. Only one way to find out, Calvin had replied, counting out $25 in crumpled bills. It represented nearly a tenth of their remaining money, but if his calculations were correct, this investment would pay dividends far beyond its cost. Now, 4 weeks into their new life, Calvin was installing their power system while Jamal watched with fascination. The boy had become his eager apprentice, learning to strip wire and test connections, absorbing electrical theory through hands-on experience rather than textbook explanations. The sun hits the panel and knocks electrons loose, Calvin explained, as he connected the charging controller to their battery bank. Those electrons flow through the wire to our batteries, where they get stored until we need them. It's like catching sunlight in a jar, and then we can use it to power our lights. And radio? Exactly. Your great-grandfather never had electricity when he was camping, but he also didn't have solar panels. We're taking the best of the old ways and combining it with appropriate technology. The system was modest but functional, enough power to run LED lights, charge small electronics, and operate the radio Calvin had assembled from salvaged components. It wouldn't support anything energy-intensive, but it would provide the basic electrical needs that would make their winter more comfortable and their isolation less complete. Joseph had become an unexpected ally in their transformation. The old man asked few questions about why Calvin needed such specific items, but his eyes held a knowing glint that suggested he understood more about their situation than he let on. He'd been running his salvage operation for 30 years, and Calvin suspected he'd helped other people disappear from the conventional world when circumstances required it. You know anything about water pumps? Joseph had asked during Calvin's third visit, gesturing toward a small electric pump that looked relatively new. A little. Why? Customer brought it back, said it didn't work right. I tested it. Works fine, just not powerful enough for what he wanted. Thought you might find a use for it. The pump had solved their water supply challenges completely. Calvin installed it in the creek with a simple filter system, running power from their solar setup and water line to their camp through buried cables and pipes. Now they had running water on demand, a luxury that made their wilderness home feel genuinely civilized. The transformation of their living space had accelerated dramatically. What had started as emergency shelter was becoming a carefully engineered homestead. Calvin had divided the bus interior into distinct areas: sleeping quarters in the back, kitchen and dining space in the middle, workshop and storage near the front. Each section served multiple purposes, with furniture that could be reconfigured depending on their needs. Jamal's 9th birthday had provided the perfect opportunity to celebrate how far they'd come. Calvin had spent weeks secretly carving a detailed wooden horse, complete with flowing mane and realistic proportions. For a cake, he'd managed to create something resembling a birthday dessert using wild berries, honey he'd traded for at Joseph's yard, and flour from acorns they'd processed themselves. "This is the best birthday ever," Jamal had declared, and Calvin believed he meant it. The boy had grown 2 inches since they'd arrived in the mountains, his face losing its city pallor as outdoor living turned him lean and strong. More importantly, he radiated a confidence Calvin had never seen before, the self-assurance that comes from knowing you can take care of yourself in any situation. "Tell me about the horse," Calvin had said as Jamal examined his gift. "He's wild but not scared," Jamal replied after studying the carving carefully. "He's strong enough to go wherever he wants, but smart enough to stay where he's safe." Calvin felt his throat tighten at his son's insight. The boy was describing more than a wooden toy. He was describing what they'd both become. Their food situation had evolved from subsistence to genuine sustainability. Calvin had established multiple gardens using permaculture principles his father had taught him decades ago. Wild plants they'd transplanted grew alongside vegetables from seeds Joseph had provided, creating a diverse ecosystem that required minimal maintenance while producing maximum nutrition. The hunting and fishing had improved with practice and better equipment. Calvin's snares now brought in regular protein, and their fishing success had increased dramatically once he'd learned the seasonal patterns of the creek. They'd also discovered a reliable source of fresh eggs from wild turkey nests, taken sparingly, to avoid disrupting the birds' reproduction. "Dad, we're like the animals now," Jamal observed one evening as they cleaned fish by the creek. "We know where to find food, we have a safe place to sleep, and we don't need anyone else to take care of us." "That's the goal," Calvin agreed. "Independence doesn't mean being alone. It means being capable enough that you choose your connections, instead of depending on them." But Calvin was increasingly aware that their isolation came with costs. Jamal's social development concerned him. The boy had no interaction with other children, no exposure to different viewpoints, no opportunity to test himself against peers. Calvin tried to compensate by creating challenges that would build the same skills, but he knew it wasn't the same as natural social learning. The educational component of their life had become surprisingly sophisticated. Calvin had discovered that teaching Jamal forced him to understand concepts more deeply himself. Mathematics came through construction projects and resource management. Science emerged from daily observations of weather, plant growth, and animal behavior. History lived in the stories Calvin shared about his father and grandfather, connecting their current experience to generations of practical wisdom. "Write about what you learned today" had become their evening ritual with both father and son, documenting their discoveries and reflections. Jamal's journal entries were becoming more detailed and more thoughtful, showing a maturity that impressed and occasionally worried Calvin. The radio system provided their primary connection to the outside world. Calvin monitored weather reports, news broadcasts, and emergency frequencies, staying informed about events beyond their mountain sanctuary. The economic situation had worsened since they'd left civilization. Unemployment was rising, social services were being cut, and the housing crisis had deepened. Calvin felt vindicated in their choice to step outside a system that seemed increasingly unable to support people like them. As autumn approached, Calvin's confidence in their long-term survival grew stronger each day. They had reliable shelter, sustainable food sources, clean water, and power systems that functioned independently of any grid. More importantly, they had skills that would serve them regardless of external circumstances. "We're ready for winter," Calvin told Jamal as they completed their latest improvement, a root cellar that would keep their preserved foods fresh through the coldest months. "Are you sure?" Jamal asked, though his tone suggested excitement rather than worry. Calvin looked around their transformed homestead, the solar panels gleaming on the bus roof, the garden plots heavy with late-season vegetables, the workshop area organized with tools they'd made or salvaged, the water system running quietly in the background. They'd created something that worked, something that could sustain them indefinitely if necessary. "I'm sure," Calvin said, and for the first time in months, he meant it completely. The hand-built radio crackled to life as Calvin fine-tuned them. Frequency, its antenna, a carefully positioned length of copper wire, catching signals from the world they'd left behind. 8 weeks into their mountain existence, this electronic lifeline had become their window into a reality that felt increasingly foreign and distant. "Good evening. This is WTNN News with your 6 o'clock report." The announcer's voice emerged from the speaker with surprising clarity. Unemployment in the state reached a new high today as 3 more manufacturing facilities announced permanent closures. Governor Williams promised additional job training programs, but critics question whether. Calvin adjusted the volume so Jamal could hear without the sound carrying beyond their carefully concealed camp. The economic news painted a grim picture of the world below. Factory closings, home foreclosures, families struggling with the same challenges that had driven Calvin and Jamal into the wilderness. In some ways, the reports validated their choice to step outside a system that seemed increasingly unable to protect its most vulnerable members. "Dad, are we lucky we're not down there anymore?" Jamal asked, looking up from the notebook where he was recording the evening's radio programming schedule they'd established as part of his continuing education. "Lucky isn't the right word," Calvin replied thoughtfully. "We made a choice, and we're working hard to make that choice successful. What we're hearing is why the choice made sense." The radio served multiple purposes beyond news consumption. Calvin had programmed it to receive weather reports, emergency broadcasts, and even some educational programming that supplemented Jamal's learning. In the evenings, they sometimes picked up music from distant stations, creating a soundtrack for their wilderness life that connected them to the broader human experience. But the radio also brought unsettling reminders of their isolation. Missing child reports made Calvin's heart race until he confirmed the descriptions didn't match Jamal. Social services announcements reminded him that somewhere Carol Smith was probably still tracking their case, still obligated to find them and determine whether Jamal was being properly cared for. "There's a story here about a family living in their car," Jamal observed, reading from his notes about the evening's news broadcast. "The reporter made it sound really sad, like they were suffering. But we don't have a regular house either, and we're not suffering." Calvin felt a complex mixture of pride and concern at his son's observation. Jamal was right. They weren't suffering. In many ways, they were thriving. The boy had gained weight and muscle tone, his complexion was healthy from outdoor living, and his confidence had grown exponentially. But Calvin worried about Jamal's increasing disconnection from conventional social expectations. "The difference is choice and preparation," Calvin explained. "That family probably didn't choose their situation, and they might not have the skills to improve it. We chose this life, and we're building it intentionally. But if people knew what we'd learned up here, maybe they could make better choices too." The comment struck Calvin as surprisingly sophisticated for a 9-year-old, and it raised questions he'd been trying to avoid. Were they being selfish in keeping their discoveries to themselves? Did their successful adaptation to wilderness living represent knowledge that could help others facing similar economic pressures? Their homestead continued evolving daily. Calvin had completed a rainwater collection system that provided backup water storage for dry periods. Their food preservation methods now included smoking, drying, and root cellar storage techniques that would keep them well fed through the harshest winter conditions. The solar power system had been expanded with a second salvage panel, providing enough electricity to run essential systems, plus some conveniences that made their isolation more comfortable. The workshop area had become Calvin's pride and joy. Tools he'd made or modified hung in organized rows, their handles worn smooth by constant use. He'd created a forge from stones and scrap metal, allowing him to repair and reshape metal objects they found or salvaged. Jamal had his own work area, with child-sized tools, learning craftsmanship principles that most children his age would never encounter. "Look what I made," Jamal announced one afternoon, holding up a small wooden bowl he'd carved from a piece of maple burl. The craftsmanship was surprisingly sophisticated. Smooth curves, even wall thickness, a pleasant weight in the hand. "That's beautiful work," Calvin said, examining the bowl with genuine admiration. "Your great-grandfather would have been proud of that." "Really? Really? You're learning skills that men used to pass down through generations. Most people today don't even know these things are possible, but their success was creating its own challenges." The more comfortable and sustainable their homestead became, the more Calvin worried about discovery. They'd had 3 close encounters with hikers in the past 2 weeks, people who'd wandered off the established trails and might have spotted evidence of their presence, if not for careful concealment practices. One encounter had been particularly concerning. A couple with expensive camping gear had made camp less than half a mile from their location, staying for 2 nights and exploring the area thoroughly. Calvin and Jamal had been forced to remain, completely hidden, cooking no fires, using no power tools, communicating only in whispers. The strain of absolute concealment reminded Calvin how precarious their security really was. "Dad, why don't we just tell people we live here?" Jamal asked after the hikers had finally moved on. "We're not hurting anyone. We're taking good care of the forest. We're not taking anything that belongs to someone else." Calvin sat beside his son on their log bench, considering how to explain the complexities of their legal and social situation to a child who saw the world in terms of right and wrong, rather than legal and illegal. "Sometimes grown-up rules don't make sense," he began. "The people who made the laws about where families can live weren't thinking about people like us. They assumed everyone would want to live in regular houses in regular towns. But our life is better than that." "I think so too. But convincing other people might be difficult. What if we could show them? What if we could prove that we're healthy and happy and learning important things?" Calvin felt a chill at his son's innocent suggestion. The idea of voluntarily revealing their location, of subjecting their carefully constructed life to outside scrutiny, terrified him. They'd built something precious and fragile here, a functioning alternative to the economic and social pressures that had nearly destroyed them. Exposing it to the judgment of people who'd never faced similar challenges seemed like inviting disaster. Yet Jamal's confidence in what they'd accomplished was absolute. The boy genuinely believed their success spoke for itself, that reasonable people would recognize the value of what they'd created. His faith in the fundamental fairness of the world was both inspiring and heartbreaking. As they prepared for sleep that night, Calvin found himself torn between pride in their achievements and anxiety about their future. They'd proven they could survive and thrive in the wilderness, but how long could they remain hidden? And what would happen when the outside world finally found them? The viral photograph changed everything in the space of a single morning, transforming Calvin and Jamal from invisible survivors into unwilling celebrities. Calvin stared at the smartphone screen Joseph held in his weathered hands, his stomach dropping as he recognized their homestead captured in stunning detail. Jamal carrying water buckets from the creek while Calvin worked on their solar panel. Ray, the converted bus, visible in the background, looking like something from a survival magazine. "This was taken 3 days ago," Joseph said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of concern and something that might have been admiration. Wildlife photographer named Marcus Chen was up here documenting the fall colors. "Says he didn't even notice you folks until he was reviewing his shots back home." Calvin felt the world tilt on its axis. 3 months of careful concealment, countless precautions, all undone by a telephoto lens and a photographer's eye for compelling composition. The image was beautiful, almost artistic in its portrayal of their self-sufficient lifestyle. It was also damning evidence that they were living exactly where authorities would soon be looking. "How many people have seen it?" Calvin asked, though he dreaded the answer. Joseph scrolled through his phone with the careful concentration of someone still learning the technology. "It's been shared about 50,000 times since yesterday. News websites are picking it up. There's a whole conversation happening about who you are and whether this is real or some kind of publicity stunt." Calvin read over Joseph's shoulder as comments poured in from strangers around the world. Some were supportive, people admiring their resourcefulness and independence. Others were harshly critical, calling Calvin irresponsible for subjecting a child to primitive living conditions. A few were uncomfortably accurate in their speculation about why a father and son might be living off the grid. "Look at this one," Joseph said, pointing to a comment that made Calvin's blood run cold. "That kid looks like the missing boy from the Tennessee Amber Alert 6 weeks ago. Someone should report this to authorities." The comment had been liked dozens of times and spawned a thread of increasingly specific speculation about their identity. Calvin realized with growing horror that their story was being constructed by strangers who had no real knowledge of their situation, but plenty of assumptions about what might drive a man to disappear into the wilderness with his child. "There's more," Joseph continued, switching to a news website. "Channel 7 in Nashville is calling you the Mystery Mountain Family. They're asking viewers to help identify your location. And the Department of Children's Services issued a statement saying they're investigating reports of an unaccompanied minor living in unsafe conditions." Calvin's hands shook as he absorbed the implications. Carol Smith would see this coverage within hours if she hadn't already. Search teams would be organizing. Their sanctuary was about to become the center of a media circus and law enforcement operation. "Dad, what's happening?" Jamal asked, emerging from behind the supply shed where he'd been feeding their chickens, wild birds they'd domesticated over the past month. Calvin looked at his son, seeing him through the eyes of strangers who would judge their situation. Without understanding the context, Jamal was healthy, confident, articulate, and obviously well cared for, but he was also dressed in home-modified clothing, living in a converted bus, educated by wilderness experience rather than formal schooling. To people who measured child welfare by conventional standards, their success might look like neglect. "We need to talk," Calvin said, guiding Jamal to their favorite sitting spot by the creek. "That photographer I told you about, the one who's been taking pictures of the forest, he accidentally got us in one of his shots. Are we in trouble?" Calvin chose his words carefully. "We might be. People are seeing the picture and making assumptions about why we're living here. Some think we're hiding from something bad. Others think I'm not taking proper care of you." Jamal's expression grew serious in the way it did when he was processing complex information. "But they don't know us. They don't know how much I've learned or how good we are at taking care of ourselves." "That's right. They don't know us. But they might try to find us anyway, to check on our situation. And if they find us?" Calvin had been dreading this conversation for weeks, but now it was unavoidable. "They might decide you'd be better off living with a foster family while I figure out how to provide for you in a more conventional way. But I don't want to live with strangers. This is our home. We built it together." "I know, son. I know." The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation and difficult decisions. Calvin knew they had perhaps a day, maybe 2, before search teams would locate their camp. The viral photograph provided enough landmarks for experienced woodsmen to triangulate their approximate location. Once helicopters were involved, their concealment would be useless. Joseph proved to be an unexpected ally in their crisis. "I've been thinking about your situation for weeks," he admitted as they loaded supplies into Calvin's truck. What you folks have accomplished up here is remarkable. That boy is getting an education most kids can only dream of. But the world doesn't always recognize success when it comes in unconventional packages. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting you get ahead of this story instead of letting it happen to you. Take control of the narrative before someone else writes it for you. Calvin spent the afternoon in agonizing deliberation. They could run, pack up their essential belongings, and disappear deeper into the mountains. But winter was coming, and starting over in a new location would be exponentially more difficult. They could try to hide and hope the search would be brief and unsuccessful, or they could do what Joseph suggested, come forward on their own terms, and trust that their obvious success would speak for itself. What do you think we should do? Calvin asked Jamal as they sat by their fire that evening, perhaps for the last time in their hidden sanctuary. Jamal considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I think we should show them what we've built. Not because we have to, but because we're proud of it, even if it means they might separate us. Dad, look around. Look at everything we've done here. Look at how healthy and happy I am. Look at how much we've both learned. If they can't see that this is good for us, then they're not very smart. Calvin felt a surge of pride mixed with terror. His son's confidence was absolute, not the blind faith of childhood, but the earned self-assurance of someone who'd met every challenge and emerged stronger. Jamal believed in what they'd accomplished because he'd lived it, learned it, helped, built it with his own hands. That night, Calvin made his decision. He would contact the media directly, offering an exclusive interview in exchange for the opportunity to tell their story properly. He would invite authorities to inspect their homestead and evaluate Jamal's education and welfare firsthand. He would bet everything on the possibility that reasonable people would recognize success even when it came in an unexpected form. As he drafted his email to Marcus Chen, the photographer whose image had changed their lives, Calvin realized that this moment had been inevitable from the beginning. They couldn't hide forever, and maybe they shouldn't. If their experiment in alternative living was truly successful, perhaps it was time to share that success with the world. The viral photograph that had felt like a disaster that morning began to look more like an opportunity. For 3 months, they'd proven to themselves that another way of living was possible. Now, they would have the chance to prove it to everyone else. Calvin looked at the image one more time before sending his message. In the photograph, he and Jamal looked exactly like what they were, a father and son who'd found a way to thrive despite impossible circumstances, who'd built something meaningful from nothing but determination and love. If that wasn't worth defending, nothing was. The reply from Marcus Chen came within an hour. I'd be honored to help you tell your story properly. When can we meet? Calvin's handwritten letter sat on the makeshift table like a declaration of war against a world that measured success in paychecks and progress reports. 4 pages of careful script outlined their journey from desperation to self-sufficiency, from factory fire to functional homestead, from conventional failure to unconventional triumph. Every word had been chosen deliberately, every sentence crafted to defend choices that most people would never have to make. Dad, read it to me one more time, Jamal requested, settling beside his father on their log bench as the morning sun filtered through the canopy above their hidden sanctuary. Calvin cleared his throat and began, to anyone who questions whether a father has the right to choose his own path in raising his son, I offer this account of our journey. 3 months ago, I lost everything I thought mattered: my job, my home, my savings, my sense of security. What I discovered in losing those things was that I still had the most important thing, my responsibility to provide for my son in whatever way circumstances required. As Calvin read, he watched Jamal's face for any sign of doubt or worry. The boy listened with the same focused attention he brought to learning new survival skills, absorbing not just the words, but their deeper meaning. At 9 years old, Jamal understood that this letter would determine whether they could keep the life they'd built together. When I brought Jamal into these mountains, I wasn't running from responsibility. I was running toward it. I was choosing to be the kind of father my own father had been, someone who could provide for his family through knowledge, skills, and determination, rather than dependence on systems that had proven unreliable. The letter went on to document their achievements in detail: the sustainable food systems, the renewable energy setup, the educational program that had accelerated Jamal's learning beyond anything possible in conventional schooling. Calvin described their daily routines, their safety protocols, their preparation for winter. He addressed every concern a reasonable person might raise about their lifestyle, while demonstrating that they'd not just survived, but thrived under conditions that would defeat most families. Marcus Chen, the photographer whose viral image had exposed their hidden world, was due to arrive within the hour. Behind him would come a documentary crew from a major network, followed by social services investigators and potentially law enforcement. Calvin had negotiated carefully for the right to tell their story first, before others imposed their own interpretations on what they'd built. "Are you nervous?" Jamal asked as Calvin folded the letter and placed it in the waterproof container where they kept their most important documents. "Terrified," Calvin admitted, "but not of what we've done. I'm terrified that people won't understand why we did it, or that they'll focus on what we don't have instead of what we've accomplished. What if they make us leave?" Calvin had been dreading this question, but Jamal deserved an honest answer. Then we'll have shown that this life is possible, and maybe other families facing the same problems will know they have choices. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is prove that alternatives exist, even if you can't keep them forever. The morning hours passed in frantic preparation. Calvin and Jamal had spent the previous day organizing their homestead to tell their story. Most effectively, every system, every innovation, every adaptation had been cleaned, labeled, and documented. Their home needed to speak for itself to people who might arrive with predetermined opinions about what constituted proper child rearing. Joseph arrived first, bringing supplies and moral support in equal measure. The old salvage dealer had become their strongest advocate, and Calvin suspected his presence would lend credibility to their story. Joseph understood the value of making something from nothing, of finding solutions that didn't depend on institutional approval. "Media van just turned onto the logging road," Joseph reported, checking his phone for the latest updates on their situation. "Looks like your story is getting national attention. CNN wants an interview, and there's a book publisher asking about rights to your story." Calvin felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what their simple survival had become. 3 months ago, they'd been invisible refugees from economic collapse. Now they were potential celebrities, symbols of either admirable self-reliance or dangerous neglect, depending on who was doing the judging. "Remember what we practiced," Calvin told Jamal, as they heard vehicles approaching through the trees. "Answer their questions honestly, show them what you've learned, and trust that the truth is strong enough to protect us." Jamal nodded, his composure impressive for someone whose entire future hung in the balance. The boy had dressed in his best clothes, still obviously handmade and modified, but clean and well-fitted. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his worth wasn't determined by others' opinions. Marcus Chen emerged from the lead vehicle, followed by a small crew carrying professional camera equipment. The photographer was younger than Calvin had expected, maybe 35, with the kind of respectful demeanor that suggested he understood the significance of what he was documenting. "Mr. Davis, thank you for trusting us with your story," Chen said, extending his hand. "I want you to know that my goal is to show the world exactly what I saw through my lens. A family that has created something remarkable against impossible odds. That's all we ask," Calvin replied. "Just show them what is, not what people think should be." The documentary crew worked with surprising sensitivity, allowing Calvin and Jamal to demonstrate their daily routines without intrusion or commentary. They filmed the morning water collection, the garden maintenance, the solar panel adjustment, the food preparation. Each activity revealed layers of competence and planning that transformed their wilderness existence from primitive survival into sophisticated sustainability. "Tell me about your education," the interviewer asked Jamal, as cameras captured him identifying edible plants and explaining their nutritional properties. "I learn something new every day," Jamal replied with genuine enthusiasm. "Yesterday I learned how to predict weather changes by watching how spiders build their webs. Last week, Dad taught me how to calculate angles using shadows and stick measurements. I know more about biology from living with plants and animals than I ever learned from books." Calvin watched the crew's faces as Jamal spoke, seeing their assumptions. Challenged by obvious intelligence and articulate communication, his son was providing the most powerful argument for their lifestyle simply by being himself, healthy, curious, confident, and remarkably mature for his age. "What do you miss most about your old life?" the interviewer asked. Jamal considered the question seriously. "I miss having friends my age to talk to sometimes, but I don't miss being worried all the time about whether we'd have enough money or whether Dad could find work. Here, we know we can take care of ourselves no matter what happens." The honesty of the response left the interviewer momentarily speechless. Calvin realized that his son had just articulated something profound about their transformation. They'd traded social connections for security, conventional normalcy for genuine peace of mind. As the day progressed, Calvin felt his confidence growing. The documentary was capturing exactly what he'd hoped, evidence that their success was real, sustainable, and beneficial for both of them. Every question revealed another layer of thoughtful preparation, another example of skills most people had never developed. But the real test was still coming. Carol Smith, the social worker who'd been tracking their case since the beginning, had requested permission to conduct an official welfare assessment. Her evaluation would carry legal weight that no amount of positive media coverage could overcome. "She'll be here tomorrow morning," Joseph reported during a brief break in filming. "She's bringing a child psychologist and an educational specialist. This is your chance to prove that Jamal's development has been enhanced, not hindered, by your choices." Calvin spent the evening preparing Jamal for what might be their most important performance, not a show for cameras, but a demonstration for officials who held the power to separate them forever. They reviewed Jamal's learning achievements, practiced articulating their daily routines, and prepared to defend a lifestyle that had given them everything that mattered. As they sat by their fire one last time before the official inspection, Calvin realized that regardless of tomorrow's outcome, they'd already won something important. They'd proven to themselves that another way of living was possible, that families could thrive outside the conventional systems that had failed them. "Dad, whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that this has been the best time of my whole life," Jamal said quietly. "Even if they make us leave, I'll never forget what we built here together." Calvin pulled his son closer, feeling the weight of responsibility and the lightness of love in equal measure. Tomorrow would determine whether they could keep their sanctuary, but tonight they were exactly where they belonged, together, competent, and free. The documentary camera followed Calvin and Jamal through their morning routine with the respectful distance of observers who understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. As Calvin adjusted their solar panel array to catch the optimal angle of autumn sunlight, the lens captured not just the technical competence of the system, but the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd learned to provide electricity for his family, using nothing but salvaged materials and accumulated knowledge. "The panels generate about 400 watts at peak sunlight," Calvin explained to Marcus Chen, while Jamal demonstrated the battery monitoring system with the fluency of someone half his age explaining a video game. "We use LED lighting exclusively, and our power consumption never exceeds our generation capacity. In winter, we'll have fewer daylight hours, but we've calculated our energy budget to account for seasonal variation." The interviewer, a seasoned journalist named Rebecca Martinez, who'd covered everything from war zones to political scandals, seemed genuinely impressed by the sophistication of their setup. This level of planning and execution, how long did it take you to develop these systems? About 6 weeks of trial and error, Calvin replied. But the foundation knowledge came from my father, who taught me that you can solve almost any problem if you understand the basic principles involved, and you're willing to work with what's available. And Jamal, how much of this technology do you understand? Jamal looked up from the battery bank where he'd been checking voltage levels with a multimeter. Dad taught me how electricity works by having me help build everything. I can wire a simple circuit, test connections, and troubleshoot most problems. I also know how to maintain the system and what to do if something breaks. Rebecca exchanged glances with her camera operator, a subtle communication that suggested they were capturing material that would challenge viewers' assumptions about childhood education. Calvin felt a surge of pride as he watched his son demonstrate knowledge that most high school graduates would find challenging. The tour continued through their homestead, each stop revealing another layer of careful planning and successful execution. The water system drew particular attention, not just for its engineering elegance, but for the way it solved multiple problems simultaneously. Clean water, consistent pressure, minimal environmental impact, and complete independence from municipal utilities. The pump is solar-powered, the filtration uses multiple stages including sand, charcoal, and UV sterilization, Jamal explained as he led the group to their water source. We monitor the creek's condition daily and have backup storage for times when the flow might be contaminated or reduced. How did you learn water treatment principles? Rebecca asked, her journalist's instincts recognizing a story that went far beyond simple survival. Dad explained how different contaminants require different removal methods. Then we researched natural filtration systems and adapted them to our situation. It's applied chemistry and biology together. Calvin watched the documentary crew absorb his son's casual expertise in subjects that university students struggled to master. Jamal wasn't showing off. He was simply sharing knowledge he'd acquired through necessity, curiosity, and hands-on application. The boy had become fluent in practical sciences because his daily life required understanding how the world worked at a fundamental level. The food production systems provided the most dramatic evidence of their success. Garden plots integrated with the natural ecosystem produced vegetables, herbs, and medicinal plants in quantities that seemed impossible for such a small space. Fruit trees they'd planted were already showing promising growth, and their food preservation area contained enough stored provisions to last well into winter. We eat better now than we ever did in town, Jamal announced as he showed off their root cellar, smoker, and drying racks. Dad taught me which wild plants are nutritious, how to hunt and fish responsibly, and how to preserve food without refrigeration. I probably know more about nutrition than most adults. What's your favorite meal that you prepare here? Rebecca asked. Trout that I caught myself, cooked over a fire I built, with wild vegetables I gathered and bread made from acorns I processed. It tastes better because I understand where everything came from and how much work went into getting it. Calvin felt his throat tighten at his son's simple eloquence. The boy wasn't just describing a meal, he was describing a relationship with food, with labor, with self-sufficiency that most people in modern society had never experienced. Every bite Jamal ate was connected to knowledge, effort, and appreciation in ways that supermarket shopping could never provide. As the morning progressed, Calvin realized that the documentary was capturing something more profound than a survival story. They were documenting an alternative model of childhood development, one that prioritized competence over compliance, practical knowledge over abstract learning, and independence over institutional dependence. Mr. Davis, what would you say to critics who argue that you're depriving Jamal of a normal childhood? Rebecca asked, as they returned to the converted bus for the next phase of interviews. Calvin considered the question carefully, aware that his answer might determine how their story was ultimately perceived by the millions of people who would eventually see this footage. "I'd say that normal isn't working for a lot of families right now," he replied slowly. "Normal got us homeless and hopeless. What we've built here has made both of us stronger, smarter, and more capable of handling whatever life brings us. If that's not what childhood should accomplish, I don't know what is." The property deed that Joseph pulled from his weathered manila envelope looked like salvation, written in legal language and official seals. Calvin stared at the document that would change everything, his hands trembling as he recognized his father's name in the formal property description: Samuel Davis, deceased, transferring ownership to Calvin Davis, sole heir, for a parcel of land that encompassed exactly where they'd built their wilderness home. "Your daddy bought this section from the timber company back in 1987, Joseph explained, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who'd spent weeks researching dusty courthouse records. Paid cash, filed all the proper paperwork, but never got around to developing it. I reckon he always planned to build a retirement cabin up here, but the cancer took him before he had the chance." Calvin felt the weight of generations settling on his shoulders as he realized his father's final gift: land. That represented not just legal security, but a continuation of the wilderness wisdom that had shaped both their lives. Samuel Davis had somehow known that his son might one day need a place beyond the reach of economic uncertainty, a sanctuary where practical skills mattered more than employment statistics. "How did you know to look for this?" Calvin asked, still absorbing the implications of legitimate ownership. "Something about the way you moved through these woods, the way you talked about your daddy's camping trips, reminded me of the way landowners walk their property, not like visitors, but like folks who belong somewhere. Figured there might be more to your family history up here than you realized." Carol Smith arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, accompanied by Dr. Sarah Williams, a child psychologist, and Margaret Torres, an educational specialist. Calvin watched their faces as they emerged from their vehicle, noting the professional skepticism that came with years of evaluating family situations that rarely lived up to parents' optimistic descriptions. "Mr. Davis, we're here to conduct a comprehensive assessment of Jamal's living conditions, educational progress, and psychological well-being," Carol announced, her tone formal but not unfriendly. "I hope you understand that this evaluation will determine whether current custody arrangements are in Jamal's best interests." "I understand completely," Calvin replied, offering them the property deed as his first piece of evidence. "Before we begin, I think you should know that we're not squatters or transients. This is legally our land, and this is legally our home." Carol examined the deed with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to parents producing questionable documentation. But as she read the legal description, cross-referenced the survey markers, and confirmed the official seals, her expression shifted from skepticism to surprise. "This appears to be legitimate," she said finally. "You own 47 acres of mountain forest, including mineral and water rights." "My father's legacy," Calvin confirmed. "He taught me to live on this land when I was a boy, and now I'm teaching my son the same skills. We're not hiding from society. We're exercising our right to live differently." Dr. Williams began her psychological evaluation with the gentle probing that characterized her profession. But Jamal's responses quickly moved the conversation beyond standard assessment protocols. The boy demonstrated emotional stability, social awareness, and cognitive flexibility that impressed even experienced professionals. "Tell me about your friendships, Jamal," Dr. Williams asked. "Do you miss playing with children your age?" "Sometimes I wish I had friends to share what I've learned," Jamal replied thoughtfully. "But I'm not lonely. Dad and I work together all day. We talk about everything, and I'm learning skills that will help me my whole life. I think some kids my age might be lonelier in big schools, where they don't really matter to anyone." Margaret Torres, the educational specialist, tested Jamal's academic progress using standardized assessments adapted for unconventional learning environments. The results exceeded everyone's expectations, including Calvin's. His mathematics skills are approximately 2 grade levels above average for his age group, she reported. Science knowledge is extraordinary, particularly in biology, chemistry, and physics applications. Reading comprehension is excellent, and his writing demonstrates vocabulary and conceptual understanding that suggests gifted-level intelligence. But what about socialization, cultural literacy, preparation for higher education? Carol pressed, fulfilling her obligation to consider every aspect of child development. Those are valid concerns, Margaret acknowledged. But this young man demonstrates problem-solving abilities, independence, and practical knowledge that most college students lack. His education may be unconventional, but it's clearly effective. Calvin felt a surge of validation as the professionals documented what he'd known intuitively, that Jamal was thriving in ways that conventional schooling might never have achieved. The boy's confidence, competence, and articulate intelligence spoke louder than any standardized test could measure. The final evaluation came from Dr. Williams, whose psychological assessment would carry the most weight in determining Jamal's future. She spent 2 hours observing their interactions, testing emotional bonds, and evaluating the boy's mental health using established protocols. Mr. Davis, I've rarely seen a parent-child relationship this strong or this healthy, she announced as the evaluation concluded. Jamal shows no signs of trauma, neglect, or developmental delays. In fact, his emotional maturity and self-confidence are remarkable for his age. Whatever you're doing here, it's working exceptionally well. Carol Smith faced the most difficult decision of her career, whether to disrupt a family that was clearly succeeding despite living in ways that challenged every conventional standard for child welfare. Calvin's teaching certificate arrived in the mail 6 months after their story first captured national attention, the official document representing a transformation he could never have imagined when flames consumed his old life. The state of Tennessee had created a new classification for wilderness educators, acknowledging that learning could happen in places beyond traditional classrooms and that some forms of knowledge required mountains and forests rather than textbooks and tests. Dad, the Henderson family is here for their weekend workshop, Jamal called from the expanded parking area, where a modest gravel lot now accommodated the steady stream of visitors who came to learn what Calvin and his son had discovered about sustainable living. At 10 years old, Jamal had grown into his role as both student and teacher, comfortable explaining complex concepts to adults who'd never learned to read the natural world. Calvin emerged from the workshop building they'd constructed adjacent to their original bus home, wiping sawdust from his hands as he prepared to greet another family seeking alternatives to the economic pressures that had once driven them into these mountains. The Hendersons represented a growing demographic, middle-class professionals whose financial security had evaporated in the continuing economic downturn, forcing them to consider lifestyle changes they'd never previously contemplated. "Welcome to Mountain Skills Academy," Calvin said, extending his hand to Tom Henderson, a former bank manager whose institution had closed 3 months earlier. "I understand you're interested in learning some basic sustainability practices. We never thought we'd be in this position," Tom's wife, Linda, admitted, her voice carrying the bewildered tone Calvin remembered from his own early days of crisis. "But with both our jobs gone and the house in foreclosure, we need to learn how to live on a lot less money." Their 12-year-old daughter, Amy, stared wide-eyed at the transformed homestead that had become a model of elegant efficiency. The original bus remained at the center of their expanded compound, but they'd added several outbuildings using sustainable construction techniques. Solar panels gleamed on multiple roofs, gardens flourished in carefully planned plots, and the sound of running water indicated the sophisticated systems that provided all their utilities without dependence on external infrastructure. The goal isn't to live like we're camping, Calvin explained as he began their tour. The goal is to live well while being completely self-sufficient. We have hot showers, electric lights, fresh food year-round, and comfortable shelter. We just don't depend on anyone else to provide those things. Jamal took charge of Amy's orientation while Calvin worked with the parents, a natural division of labor that had evolved over months of hosting families from around the country. The boy had developed his own teaching style, emphasizing hands-on learning and patient explanation of concepts that seemed magical to children accustomed to urban conveniences. "Watch this," Jamal said, demonstrating their water pumping system. "Solar power runs the pump that brings clean water from the creek to storage tanks. Then gravity feeds it to all our buildings. No electric company, no water bill, no dependence on infrastructure that might fail during emergencies." Calvin observed his son with pride that had deepened into something approaching awe. Jamal had exceeded every expectation for childhood development, growing into a young man whose competence and confidence inspired adults twice his age. The boys' education continued through their teaching activities. Each family brought new questions, different perspectives, and fresh challenges that kept both Calvin and Jamal learning alongside their students. Their success had attracted national attention beyond the original documentary. Calvin's book, Building Hope from Nothing, A Father's Guide to Wilderness Self-Sufficiency, had become a bestseller, providing financial security that allowed them to expand their educational mission. Television appearances, magazine articles, and speaking engagements had transformed them from hidden refugees into recognized experts on alternative living. But the greatest validation came from the families who returned months or years after. Their initial training reporting successful adaptations of what they'd learned in the mountains. Some had built complete homesteads, others had modified their urban living with sustainability practices, and a few had made the complete transition to off-grid independence. "You've started a movement," observed Dr. Patricia Chen, an educational researcher who'd been studying their teaching methods for her doctoral dissertation. Families are discovering that children can thrive outside conventional systems, that education can be more effective when it's connected to real-world applications. Calvin had mixed feelings about being labeled a movement leader. Their choice had been born from desperation rather than ideology, and their success had come through necessity rather than theory. But he couldn't deny the broader implications of what they'd proven, that families could create security through knowledge and skills rather than employment and institutional dependence. "The most important thing we teach isn't technical skills," Calvin told the gathering of families who'd come for their quarterly reunion and advanced training session. "It's confidence. Once you know you can provide for yourself and your family, regardless of external circumstances, you stop being afraid of economic uncertainty. You start making choices based on what's best for your family rather than what's required by systems that may not have your interests at heart." As the day wound down and visiting families prepared for their evening campfire session, Calvin found himself in the quiet moments of reflection that had become precious to him. The same creek that had provided their first clean water still ran beside their home, but now it also powered micro-hydro generators that supplemented their solar arrays during winter months. Jamal approached with his ever-present journal, now in its 4th volume, since they'd begun documenting their wilderness education. "Dad, Mrs. Torres from the State Education Department wants to know if we'd consider developing a curriculum that other families could use to homeschool their children using our methods." Calvin smiled at his son's casual mention of official recognition from the same bureaucracy that had once threatened to separate them. "What do you think? Are you ready to help other kids learn what you've learned?" "I think that's exactly what we should do," Jamal replied with the quiet certainty that had become his trademark. "We proved that families can choose their own path and succeed. Now we should help other families understand they have the same choice." As they walked toward their evening fire, Calvin reflected on the journey that had brought them from desperate refugees to recognized teachers. The factory fire that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of something neither of them could have imagined. They'd learned that strength came not from what you owned, but from what you could do, that education happened not in buildings, but in minds ready to learn, and that family bonds grew stronger under pressure rather than weaker. The mountains around them held the same ancient promise they'd always offered: refuge for those brave enough to accept the challenge of living by their own capabilities rather than others' provisions. Calvin and Jamal had answered that challenge and found not just survival but purpose, not just security but joy, not just independence but the deep satisfaction of building something meaningful from nothing but love and determination.